Here we are, and Amy, you can start now.
Okay. Well, I'm still going to follow the tract of your journey
My journey.
and your sort of spiritual faith journey. But to bridge last week's wonderful sermon and today, last week you talked to us about the practice of Tonglen, of breathing in someone or a people's suffering and breathing out light and love and back infusing the world. I may not have put that the way you expressed it, but I know people have wondered about that and wondered about the impact of that, and I wondered if you would, I'm not putting you on the spot for another sermon because I have lots of other questions, but if you'd just speak a little bit to the impact of that and maybe lead us in a short Tonglen meditation.
Okay. So let's kind of look at the different steps of that process. One thing that we have to do is I believe we should do going into that kind of practice is that we have to center ourselves a little bit. And so while we're sitting here, we can kind of just center ourselves in this moment. And we're going to be calling on a part of ourselves that is our strength and the light that is in us. And I think that that's an important thing to think about before you do it, because understanding that we're connected to that essence of God and that channel of love that exists within us, in a way, we want to make sure that we're both present, but we're also a little bit out of the way, meaning that we're gonna kind of empty ourselves a little bit first, so that we can let in that suffering that we're observing or that we're experiencing in the world, before we replace it with something. But what we replace it with is that deeper love, that deeper essence that we're with. So we'll just sit for a moment, and I'll mouth the words of what we're going to do, so that you can do it, that everyone can do it together. So in silence for a moment. And during this moment of silence, connect to your breath, just the simple breathing in and out at a very comfortable level. In this moment, from your experience, from what you've observed in suffering or pain, of your observation of intolerance or your own feelings of suffering and pain, breathe that in, because you are going to hold that for those who are suffering. You're using that strength when you breathe in to connect to that deep part of yourself that can hold it. No judgment, no solution making, just simply holding and witnessing. So let's take that first deep breath in of that experience and that observation. And then calling on that deep part of yourself that is that essence of love, replace that suffering in the world with the love. Replace it with the compassion and kindness that you feel inside of yourself. And let that come from a place of infinite resource. Our opening to hold that suffering is also the opening that allows us to pass out to the world and to those in need our love and compassion, but also the bearing witness of the truth that moment. So breathe in the suffering, breathe out the compassion and kindness. And as we continue breathing, if we can hold a little bit more, or that we can expand our understanding of suffering to more people, to more situations. Let us hold that in and continue to breathe out kindness and compassion. One more deep breath in and out. And then let's bring ourselves back into the balance of strength and truth. We're holding the truth of what we've seen and experienced. And as we get ready to re-enter this space, we just bring our awareness and our willingness to be witnesses to the world, to be agents of compassion and kindness. And from this moment forward, both here for me and Amy and for you who are listening, to be in that awareness and begin the next moment with the same awareness. Amen.
Thank you. Well, and thanks for asking me to do this. You and Stelly coming to Ladera has been such a gift. And so it feels both an honor and a joy to have this conversation. And Stelly's going to keep an eye on us because I have a lot of questions, so don't worry. It will be finite, even though it doesn't look like it from my paper. I wondered if we could begin just by me asking, do you have a favorite story in the Bible?
I think actually my favorite story is the one that is this week where Jesus is before Pilate. And I think that for him as a human being, the human side of his nature to be confronted, I mean, he knows he's going to die. He knows he's confronted the crowds both for and against him. He's been trying to teach his disciples, and he's in that moment where sort of practice and presence and belief, faith all come together. And in that moment, when he looks at Pilate and Pilate tries to corner him in terms of either what he is or what he's trying to do or what he is as a leader of the people that have followed him, he states his purpose very clearly, and he doesn't feel compelled to go beyond and try to overcome or convince or change somebody out there in the world. He's not asking him to be different in the sense of having an expectation of him being different. He knows him, he sees him, and he says to him, you know, for this I came into the world, to bear witness to the truth. And I think that that's one of the reasons I'm attracted to a practice like Tonglen and other spiritual practices that have to do with presence and awareness, because that's that moment of spiritual opportunity. That's that moment when we understand that our mere presence is such a compelling statement in the world, that we don't have to be anything other than who we are and what we are in the most critical moment of our lives, where really, literally, his life hangs in the balance, and he's able to give that statement. So to me, it's both a compelling story, but it's also a very powerful moment for anyone that realizes their spiritual purpose in the world to see that example of that in a human being.
So I think most of you know that Jeff has had a really interesting life, a business life, a writer's life, a pastoral life. I may be missing key pieces. But looking at that story and thinking about your own spiritual journey, and I can ask this because he is a writer, so don't worry. Is there an adjective or two that you would use to describe your own spiritual journey?
Well, I need to sit with that a second. There's not one for sure. I think I would say that acceptance is probably one of the biggest elements of my journey, accepting where I've been at different times, being able to be myself in those moments, being able to make a transition from one place to another in terms of identity. The whole idea of when we change who we are, whether it's from a father and a husband to our business identity or even the different things here, we kind of go through this very ambiguous period. And so accepting that journey is just hard in a lot of ways. And so acceptance is a word that I would use for it. I'd say it's been bumpy and it oscillates. It kind of goes up and down. Being a person of words, I often try to explain it, but it's very difficult to explain. And I do find words at times, and I think one of the things that I've found is that it takes a very intentional kind of movement out to engage who I am with the world. And so having a sense of purpose, doing that without a sense of purpose would be, I think, at least for me, it'd feel disastrous because it wouldn't be a good way of connecting with people. And I think that the other theme of that journey for me is the connecting part. I think early on in my journey, I felt very much like I could do everything on my own, that I understood the world, that, the classic things that, the hubris that a young man can have can be both compelling and overwhelming and painful. And so those adjectives also go with that part of the journey. But I think appreciation for relationships and connecting with another human being is sort of at the foundational level of everything for me. And so to do any of those things, whether it be connecting to my family, connecting to the work that I do, connecting to being a pastor, connecting to being a writer, all of those have to do for me with being present myself first, but then being present for the person that I'm with and present in a larger spiritual sense. So that whatever our individual purposes are can be recognized, but also the purpose of the moment, how we happen to connect in that moment.
So you were saying that without your sense of purpose, it's okay. We love the dog too. So without the sense of purpose, it'd be a little rudderless. Is that your sense of purpose, this connection, and how
I think everybody's purpose is the same, whether they know it or not.
So,
and I think everybody's purpose is self-realization, meaning the full realization of who they are as a human being. That the gift that every person brings to the world is their unique gift of that purpose and of their expression of that in the world. And so to not connect to that is to miss the mark on just about everything. For me, in other words, that's how I see it. It's just kind of like, wow, you ever been in that meeting where everybody believes they're all working on the same purpose, but it doesn't quite go anywhere? Well, to me, that's a symptom of everybody not being present in their purpose and connecting to a larger purpose. And it flows all the way into why we pull in people from the margins in our church, or why we do that in our society, why it's so valuable to have all those voices. Because if we don't pull that in, we're missing so much opportunity to gather the energy of change and transformation, and to be, the be all you can be thing.
To go off script based on that answer, and what's been your process of self-discovery? How do you do that?
I think that, well, meditation has been important for me ever since I was 19 years old. I think the idea of presence, and when I think about meditation and some of these practices that we do, whether it's Tonglen or something else, whether it's contemplative prayer in Christianity or whatever it is, what we're doing is we're kind of withdrawing our projections onto the world. We're kind of like getting out of the idea of having an idea about things and getting back to the sense of what is actually there, what's the truth of what is there, what's the truth of myself. And the only way that I can find that truth of myself is to kind of let the other voices fade away, let them kind of pass and go away, and be fully present in the moment for myself. And then to do that practice frequently enough that I come into a sense of kind of emptiness, but not emptiness in the sense of nothing is there, more like, I'll kind of go Zen on you here, both empty and full at the same time, meaning that there's a fullness in that emptiness, that there's a presence there, that there's an acceptance, there's allowing myself to be grounded in that practice in such a way that what I feel is my true self can emerge. If I don't go through that process of kind of moving some of those things to the side or letting them pass through me and go away, I'll never get to the part of allowing my true self to emerge. And that's why I talk so frequently, probably in every sermon. I don't know if people get tired of hearing it, but connecting to that essence of who we are as a person is so essential, because that essence of us that is the deepest essence of us is also, I believe, the same as the essence of God. So that's what I do, is I go through a process of trying to allow myself to sit in that place.
Thanks. When did your faith journey individuate from the journey with your family as a child to your own?
Oh boy. Well, there were things that happened in my family with my father that I knew I was different from him when I was 5 years old. I think he knew I was different too. So there was a lot of differentiation that began very early. I think the second thing that I would say is that when I left for college, I knew I wasn't going back. So there was another step in the process there. Another moment, which I've shared before, was the moment with the deacon at the Episcopal Church where he asked me, what does it mean to you when I say to you that God loves you? That was a huge change. I knew my life would be different then, even though I didn't know what it meant. It was almost like that became a central question for me and sort of became the context of every other part of my life. So there's a lot of milestones in the journey. Part of that understanding is also that I was so different from the rest of my family. Everybody else was born in Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh. I came along after they moved to Florida. I was born rather late for my mother and father. My mother was 40, which is not that seen as being that old for a woman to have a child now, but in 1953 it was very dangerous. In fact, my mother even had a stroke during the time that she was carrying me. So I think that there was that sense of being in a very different place and being very different from everybody else from a very early time.
Was there a person who came along that served as a guide in that process, or?
Okay, yes and no. One person was Mr. Horton, the deacon, that asked me that question. I think that he had the chance of being that person, but within about a year of that question, he died of lung cancer. And so I think I saw this journey occurring without that kind of person from a relatively early age. I found a lot of resonance with an idea that's in both Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and that is the idea of there being a non-physically present teacher. In Islam, they call him the green man. In Judaism, it's one of the archangels. And that idea is very present in other spiritual traditions, like in Hinduism and stuff. There's this famous Himalayan saint named Babaji that's not really ever been seen in the physical realm, And so I think that the idea of that always felt like that's what was happening to me, that I felt like I was being led by a presence that was not sort of in a mentoring kind of way, sort of in a prophetic kind of way, in a spiritual journey manner. And one of the very a person that I read a lot, this Islamic mystic named Ibn Arabi, his journey seemed to feel like my journey, the way he described it. And one of the ways that he describes it is being alone with the alone. And it sort of highlights that sense that there are certain aspects of our journey as human beings that you're alone. And that one of the dominant feelings of God that we have is the aloneness of God, because of just the immensity and the awesomeness of God. But we also need to flip that, meaning the awesomeness and the immensity of ourselves, if we're willing to accept it.
At a certain point, God began to speak through you in a new way. Would you be willing to share that with us, and then its impact on your journey?
Sure. In 5 minutes, right? For those of you that don't know, we have a clock in front of us showing the amount of time that we have. Okay, so I'll try to make a long story somewhat short. Early in my life, I had experiences that I didn't really understand as mystical or spiritually emergent kind of experiences. It was only later that I began reading literature by a variety of sources that would say, hey, this is something happening to you, sort of like Samuel in the Bible, like he hears a voice and he goes and asks who is it, and then eventually somebody says, you better keep listening to that voice. So it was kind of a subtle process. But when Stelly and I were in Palo Alto in 2003, that changed in a really major way. And what happened was I had an instance where I lost consciousness. And when I woke up from that unconscious state, Sally asked me, "Did you hear what you said?" And I said, "No." and and so, at some point, we might want to ask Stelly about her experience of me doing that, because I think that she kind of participated in it in a certain way. So a lot of that experience was kind of involuntary. And I had multiple episodes of that, enough episodes of that I went to Arthur Hastings, who was a researcher at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, who worked with people that were experiencing altered states of consciousness, not just altered states of consciousness sort of spontaneous like mine, but also people that were experimenting with drugs or other forms of sound or different things like that. So, kind of cutting to the chase, here we are 17 years later. One of the aspects of that experience that is very deeply profound for me is that all my understanding and my belief that all forms of revelation are very personal. So there's an aspect of that journey for me of having those experiences and writing about those experiences that says, okay, this is for me to work things out for myself. I wrote books about it in order for people that might want to hear about that could hear about it. It's something that I don't feel like I consciously asked for, so it's kind of a very surprising and life-altering experience to have something like that happen. I remember having a long conversation with Arthur Hastings, the researcher, about this, and I was trying to understand what I felt about it, and he says, "Well, has anything come through that you object to?" And I said, "No." And he says, "Well, then just go with it," which I kind of did. And then I've kind of gone with it with other people, like, for instance, Al Williams and I used to have long discussions about it. And I shared things with him, and he says, "Well, I don't find anything objectionable here," and I think what's my sense of that I sometimes feel self-conscious about is that the thing that people have the most difficulty with is that process itself. And in our culture, we're such strong intellectual beings. We have such a tendency to jump up into our intellect about things that when something comes from a different source within us and challenges that intellect, it's sometimes hard to get a handle on it. It was hard, and I'd have to say to some degree, it's still hard for me to get a handle on it. But at the same time, over this 17-year period, I've kind of gotten to that acceptance thing that I mentioned. I've gone with it sort of as things have progressed. If we were in India and I told someone that I spoke that way at times, nobody would even bat an eye. I think the thing that is a little bit scary about it is if you tell someone that you've connected yourself with God in such a way, there's that thing of, oh, right, you're going to tell me what God means or what God is for everyone or what God has to say to everyone. And that's not what it's about at all. I think, again, that's where it goes back to that level of personal revelation. For instance, the book of Revelation in the Bible, I think, is an experience of John of Patmos that is very similar to my experiences. I would even say that I think that book in the Bible is probably the most important book in the Bible, simply because it exposes a spiritual process of a human being that was probably at a very personal level. It's other people that have tried to place that on a table in front of the world and say, this is what's happening to everybody. And I think that that experience that I'm describing is the experience of many prophets, of many spiritual teachers, of many spiritual leaders at various times. Ultimately, I think everyone has to ask themselves, does what I'm hearing resonate for me? Does it have the ring of truth for me? And if it doesn't, let it go and go on to something else. And I think that I finally felt a little bit of comfort about talking about it, sort of in that sense. And several years ago, I didn't think that I would ever serve a church again because I wasn't sure, how do you deal with someone like me? I mean, not in the sense that I can't be a normal administrative person and deliver a sermon on Sunday or handle the day-to-day affairs of a job. But the idea of what's happening in me for another person, that can be challenging. And it's challenging to me. I mean, I don't want to say that it's not, a challenge for me. It is. But when I didn't think that I would serve a church again because of that, that's why when I went to the church in Fremont and when I came here, one of the very first things I said to the search committee is, well, you better look at my website because you need to be comfortable with that. Now, I don't know who all looked at it or didn't look at it.
So I'm going to give you the hyper challenge of 2 minutes to answer this last one. What would you say is at the heart of it for those who haven't read your website or your book, and how does it infuse the way you are pastoring and guiding us now?
The challenge of it is to know that everything about me and that is there fills everything I do for this church. So the challenge is of the spiritual path, meaning can you be on that path and can it manifest itself here? Okay. I came here because I believed that it could happen here. Then the second part of your question, how do you infuse that? That's why I talk about spiritual practice a lot. That's why I talk about what we believe and who we are is such a strong foundation that we go out from. If we go out to do social justice without that foundation, it's not going to hold together. If we go to do something in the community and it isn't built around that deep spiritual process and foundation, it's not going to hold together for very long. But there's an element of it that I think is a really huge challenge for this church. And I'm glad you asked that because I was trying to figure out how and when to say this. We have such a strong outward tendency, such a strong outward, we're so strong at going outward, like with social justice or Maple Street or affordable housing or whatever. But it feels like as a whole community, we're not all on the same page that if the church isn't here, those things will go away. So there has to be as strong a passion for creating this community as any of those choices that we choose to go out and do. And so it's sort of like if we go out so much, and the center becomes hollow, and we don't renew ourselves from that center, then it's going to fall apart.
Is a beautiful note to end on. Amen. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Amy.